You're listening to Gradient Dissent, a show about making machine learning work in the real world, and I'm your host, Lukas Biewald. Elad Gil and Sarah Guo are very prominent and successful investors in startups and especially AI startups. And they're also the co-hosts of the No Priors podcast, where I appeared recently. This is a really interesting conversation around the future of AI from an investor perspective, and I hope you enjoy it. I thought I would start off with a real softball that I'm genuinely interested in, which is one of the things I admire about you, Sarah, from my interactions with you, is you've really stayed on top of the LLM research in a way that I'm frankly jealous of. And I'm curious how you're finding research papers and how you're reading research papers and thinking about that.
Yeah, I don't have a good system for this. I actually just asked the World Brain, Twitter or X, about if there's a good home for discussion of new papers, and got a bunch of different answers, including, like automatic new search engines for research. But, I tend to be pretty portfolio company driven about it, right? So we look at the investments that we are working with, and then are paying attention to the different labs and to different universities in terms of who's doing work in these areas that could feel relevant. And then I have a paper reading group.
I guess what papers have actually informed your thinking around investments recently?
Yeah, so I think, like a lot of other people, I'm pretty interested in code gen. I think it'll be useful. I think it could be democratizing. And so there are a number of different papers that have looked at the idea of it, like what sort of feedback you would want, like what validation you might use to improve the quality of generations in a production environment. And so there are papers that are out of some researchers out of MIT and Microsoft Research, as well as DeepMind on sort of the idea of self-debugging and test generation, and how to use different tools we have in software development for improvement of quality.
And I guess, Elad, you've invested in some code gen, or at least one code generation company that I know of. Do you find this kind of research relevant? Like, is that something that you expect your portfolio CEOs to stay on top of? Or do you think that kind of companies generate more insights internally that are different than the research?
I think it really depends on what you're trying to do and like what the product is and all the rest. So, I think in code gen in particular, there's almost two angles on it, right? One is, can you train models that are more performant in terms of the generation of code and have bigger context windows so you can dump an entire repo into them or do other things like that. And those are often research problems initially, or at least engineering problems with some research roots. Separate from that is just like, what do you need to build from a product perspective? And I guess one could argue that a lot of the code gen companies are actually going too far down the path of wanting to do researchy things and not enough in some cases in terms of just like, let's ship a product quickly and see how people react, or what are the top 5 things that people really need. And so I think there's a lot of stuff you could probably just do on GPT-4 that nobody's doing, including GitHub, right? That would actually be quite useful to people. And then there's ways to hack context windows or other things that people have shown in terms of being able to, deal with larger and larger amounts of input. So I think it's a mix of both. And undoubtedly there's fundamental things that people could do that are better, but also I just think there's a bunch of product stuff people should just be doing that they aren't doing, surprisingly enough.
I guess I feel like software engineer has probably been the sort of like archetype of a founder that, seed investors like yourselves are probably looking for. Do you think that changes in a world where code generation gets much better? Like, are you encouraging your kids to even study writing code?
I'm encouraging my kids to just be on UBI. I think that's the best outcome for them, is just, giving up on life and, just doing UBI. So I'm very excited about that for them. A really random aside, and then I'll let Sarah actually answer the real question, is I think code gen is misleading for the entire industry in some sense, because it is a couple years ahead of a lot of other application areas. It uses a form of language, so it's more tractable for LLMs in certain ways. It's very highly ordered logic in some cases and very structured in some cases, if you think about it. And so it actually has a lot of characteristics that in some sense makes it a tractable problem where other problems may be much messier because you're dealing with much shittier human input relative to what CodeGen has to deal with. And so I feel like CodeGen is always going to be a bit ahead. And not just that, but engineers love working on it because it makes engineers more productive, which means it gets way more attention than any other area. And so I actually feel like we're going to see these massive advances in CodeGen, which are going to be incredibly impactful and important societally. And we've been extrapolating that to all sorts of other applications. And one could argue that those other applications are going to de facto fall short because they're going to get less attention. They're going to be less intuitive for engineers, but also they're going to be less tractable from a problem set perspective. So I think it's this really interesting thing that's kind of like causing a lot of people to think that we're farther ahead than we actually are as an industry.
Yeah, I think Elad's point is valid on application to different tasks. But yeah, I think you guys are both biased as I am in this way. Like, being able to generate software is a pretty exciting, like, general purpose tool, right? And so we can write software, we can generate software to take on many other problems. And so I agree it is ahead. And then, OpenAI in particular is ahead of others in this area. So I also agree that for many applications, you just want to use GPT-4 and even GPT-4v. But I think often about this question. Like, I have 3 kids, and like, what are they going to learn that will be useful? At Conviction, we held this hackathon for a bunch of college students that were hacking on AI projects that had built something cool or won their school hackathon or whatever. And I was struck by, these are all, CS majors, right? And the universality of their belief that, like, it's irrelevant, they don't need these skills in the future. And then like very soon people will stop learning to code was very surprising to me. And I was like, oh, but what about debugging and architecture and garbage collection, all these things that felt like important to learn. And so I don't think that set of understanding is no longer useful, right? And you can see it in like other creative fields as well. Like, is traditional video editing useful in the age of increasingly high quality video generation? Yeah, because like your ability to change something with very great control increases your expressivity. But I think like it takes the baseline up in terms of the number of people who can create software. And that piece is really exciting. If I translate that to like what I want for my kids, I think I'm still going to be like, well, you can't just be a really crappy software engineer now. You have to be a good engineer.
Yeah, I've been teaching them garbage collection as well. I'm like, pick up the garbage. So it's very similar. I think it's very important for kids to know the basics.
Well, it's funny. It's funny. Like, I feel like you could almost maybe get away with being like a bad software engineer if you have a good sense of what you want to build versus someone who kind of goes deep. I don't know. It did feel to me like it's probably a different skill set to write applications, doesn't it?
Yeah, I definitely think it's probably like different directions of like where you could take the skill set. One is like being more product oriented, as you described, right? Like the creative piece versus the mechanical piece of like, well, plugging together like these 4 APIs that's been done infinite times before, like that's probably not as useful as like thinking about user interaction or like what you can do with software.
There's a surprising number of
do
connector
before.
companies today in some sense, right? You have things like Fivetran, you're just doing a bunch of connectors. You have, one could argue something like Lean is a bunch of connectors in terms of different internal data sources. And if you look at any implementation of like ERP or a few other product categories, you're effectively just doing a bunch of different data integrations. So I think to Sarah's point, a subset of software engineering is going to go away. And if you look at the world of software, if you look at the global economy, I think I've seen estimates that it's something like $500 million a year is spent on software and $5 trillion is spent on services. And so I think a lot of the AI revolution that's coming, at least in the short term, is going to be eating against those services, right? And that's where you're going to see certain aspects of like consulting services like a Wipro or some of the more sort of, like computer science companies in some sense, being addressed through some of these APIs or through some of these applications. And then you also see it in things like legal with Harvey, or, some people are looking at accounting or other areas. And so I think there's all sorts of interesting other translations that are kind of adjacent in some sense mentally to CodeGen. That could be really interesting over time.
I wasn't actually sure where you were going with that, because I was thinking, okay, on one hand, it feels like what these applications often really need is good connectors to make them work inside of my company, like a Glean. But then also, as you point out, the connector code might be some of the best applications for automatic code generation. So, where do you land on that? Like, if I was pitching you on a modern Fivetran, I guess next gen Fivetran, a few years after Fivetran, does that feel compelling, or does that feel like, that's going to get like washed out by AI?
It depends on what it is, but for certain application areas, I think it's going to be really compelling, depending on whether or not it's attached to a workflow. Or in the case of something like Lean, you're actually building like sort of old school indices and IR-based approaches, right? And so you're basically building out all these connectors so that you can create an index and then query that index in different rich ways. And so there is some more complicated stuff that you're building on top of that in some cases. So I think it really depends on what you're actually doing. But I do think it opens up a whole category or set of categories of software to competition in ways that they weren't really tractable for competition like 5 years ago, right? Because if you spend 6 months implementing an ERP instance or implementing Workday or implementing whatever giant software system, and all you were doing was really writing connectors in to pull data from one thing to another, now you can suddenly just have an app that could potentially spin those things up for itself or copy over your data structure or whatever it may be. And so suddenly you can start competing with things that were much more defensible before. So I think it does create really interesting startup opportunities.
The categories of things that I think are really attractive for maybe initial CodeGen applications tends to be like, well, what is the engineering out there that a lot of engineers don't want to do, right? Integration, migration, customization, internal tools, right? I think there are a bunch of domains of engineering that are considered like secondary or repetitive, like big maintenance burdens. And as Elad was saying, like if you look at the size of the technology businesses, that kind of customization and integration and risk of migration like protects, those are very big businesses, right? And they may not be as protected in the future. So I don't know if the shape of the company is a connector style company, or maybe it is one of these sort of core workflow or systems of record companies, or platform companies that actually has inroads in a market that felt very I don't know, ingrained simply because the workflows and the investment was so high. Like the workflows were so standard across the industry and the investment was so high. So I think that is I think it's still like really nascent as a possibility. And like today we're in the like general tool making era, like lightweight interfaces to these models era. But I'm excited about it.
Well, so you guys are being incredibly reasonable and thoughtful, but that's not going to generate clicks. So I feel like we need to get more specific and get like real opinions out of you. Like when you look at a company like Zapier that probably a lot of us use, does that seem like a good investment or a scary investment?
I think Mike and Wade and the team are making a really big bet on AI. And I think that's like both like, I mean, if you hear what Mike has talked about in terms of the impact it's had on their company internally, just in terms of pervasiveness of use, like I think they're real believers, but I think they probably also see the risk of the reduced cost of actually writing a point-to-point integration.
So it looks like maybe they think they need to evolve into something else, doesn't it?
I think the companies that I've seen adopt this technology the fastest have been sort of technical founder-driven companies, or very product-centric ones. So that would be Zapier, that would be Notion. There's a variety of other ones. And so you kind of see these fast adoption curves for people who are kind of realizing how big of a deal this is. And if you look at Zapier as an example, Mike was looking at different AI technologies and, should Zapier get involved with like an AI research institute or other things like that quite early before ChatGPT came out and this big wave happened. And so I think people have been very, very forward looking in some cases, whether or not they thought it was going to immediately impact their business. And then of course, ChatGPT came out, and then everybody kind of woke up to really how deep a lot of this stuff was, right? That was kind of the starting gun for the industry. It's only been a year. And so I think everybody kind of forgets how little time has actually passed and how big of a wave is actually coming, because most enterprises haven't really started thinking about this yet. So I think we're still super early in this era, and whether something is an opportunity or a threat for different companies will be, something we'll only understand in hindsight, and it's going to depend a lot on how companies react, right? And so I think there's this broader, interesting question of like, what sort of value goes to incumbents versus startups, and how do we determine which goes where? And in general, I think an emerging rule of thumb is if you have an existing workflow and you're just adding something onto it, whoever owns that workflow will probably win. And if you're either going to rip and replace or there's a new workflow to be built, then that's probably a startup opportunity. And so I think that's kind of like a sort of almost generic basic rule of thumb, which will be wrong in some cases around who needs to adapt to this world versus, who can kind of coast and then 3 years later launch the AI-enabled version because they already have the distribution and a locked-in workflow.
Okay, well, I'm curious more broadly. I sit here as like a fan of AI applications, and I see kind of a range at weights and biases, but I feel like you two have this amazing lens where you're getting pitched on new AI applications constantly, and so you're probably seeing a different set of things than I'm seeing as just a consumer of it. And I'm wondering if you feel like the stuff you're seeing gives you a different lens on what's working and what's not.
I think there's definitely been a series of things that have shown explosive growth over the last year or so. And so that's everything from the obvious ones like Midjourney or ChatGPT or other companies like that. But you also see very rapid just adoption of different products. And that could be something like a Perplexity or Pika, a character.ai, which, the public information is that the average user spends something like 2 hours per session on it, which is insane if you think about the amount of usage that equates to. And then obviously there's a bunch of stuff on the more traditional B2B side in terms of things like Harvey or other companies. So it seems like there's definitely been an era of very rapid traction and adoption of AI-based products. And I think that shows how big of a technology discontinuity these things represent. And I think we're still very early in sort of both the hype and the adoption cycle. And some people say AI is overhyped, but if you just look at a lot of the stuff that's coming, or if you just look at it, it's been a year since ChatGPT has launched. Enterprises have largely just been in planning mode in terms of bigger companies. They're going to start prototyping this coming year, and then it'll take them a year or two to launch. So we're probably 3-4 years away from sort of peak AI hype. And then in parallel, you see these things growing explosively, some of the companies I mentioned. And then there's a bunch of stuff that's just going to fail outright, right? Like 90-something% of all AI companies just aren't going to end up working. And that's true of every single technology wave, right? 90-something% of internet companies didn't work, and 90-something% of mobile companies didn't work, and 90-something% of cloud companies didn't work. And so I think we're going to see the same thing here. But you do see these things getting adopted very quickly. And so I do think we're seeing a fundamental shift in terms of certain types of technology and capabilities and all the rest of it.
I think one of the things that's been most interesting to me, not to get like squishy, but is like the set of products that has taken off most quickly is creative, right? And so when you look at things like Midjourney or Pika or HeyGen, I think one of the things that's really exciting is you have an expanded definition of creatives, right? I remember one of the cynicisms about Midjourney at the beginning was like, how many people like really care about art? How many artists are there? How much are people willing to pay for illustration? Like, that's not a social product, like it's not commercial, etc. And like, well, clearly it is commercial, right? Across a broad set of use cases. I think it's much easier to see now that you've seen the example of Midjourney, like why something like Pika or HeyGen would work, like video, translates very well to marketing and advertising, and most consumed media format. But I think that's actually like pretty exciting to me. Like I think it's well understood now. Like it's new capability, orders of magnitude cheaper, replacing in many ways like a service industry, like Elad was describing before. Like these things are not really competing with video editing tools, right? They're competing with like creating from scratch or recording in a studio or drawing by hand, or artists, right? And increasing expressivity. And so I just think it's like the most obvious example of new markets or misunderstood markets from AI so far. And so if you project that forward a little bit, like I expect the enterprise stuff to move more slowly, right? Just buying cycle and sensitivity to quality and safety in enterprise applications.
Isn't a lot of this stuff enterprise though? So if you actually look at Midjourney or you look at HeyGen, I would actually argue a lot of the use cases are enterprise use cases. There are a lot of the people who are paying for them are, and so it's kind of like a market expansion plus a deflationary cycle all at once. Like I know of some organizations where they've shrunken their creative team internally, people doing graphic design or other things, or imagery because of Midjourney. So I kind of feel like it's somewhere in between. In other words, like it's not, I don't know how much revenue for some of these companies is coming from I'm sure there's people who are doing it purely for creative purposes or expression purposes, but I also think it's like, hey, I'm making a slide deck and I want to put some images in and the Google searches suck, and so I'm going to pay for Midjourney.
Yeah. I think the vast majority of usage is something business related versus like pure, sorry, that's not fair. I think at least for the video generation subscription, I think it is like commercial in terms of usage. But it depends on if you think like a product are you thinking about the user segment or are you thinking about the go-to-market? Because today, none of these businesses has like a grown-up enterprise motion with like, a dude taking people out to steak dinner with carrying real enterprise quota in like a traditional sales motion.
Which is true of any explosive growth company, right? They always start that way and then they switch over to more traditional GTM. Like that'd be Slack, that'd be Notion, that'd be Zoom. Like I think we're just seeing the same pattern in AI where you see this bottom-up adoption and then it'll convert over time into traditional go-to-market. At least it seems that way. And so it seems like a very exciting era, to your point, where we see this massive sort of grassroots, and then you're going to see the traditional buying behavior probably kick in within some period of time, just like what happened with Slack. It's kind of crazy. Slack was a great example where everybody said it was the ultimate bottoms-up company, and then when it went public, I think it was something like 500 companies in the IPO listing made up 40% of all of its revenue, even though it was so bottoms up. And then you look at Zoom and it was about 300 companies made up 30%. And so I think a lot of the companies that are considered the most bottoms up PLG companies eventually end up having to sell into bigger customers.
I guess from, where I sit as kind of a fan of these things, one thing that, the image generation, video generation, and code generation all has in common is it just like works phenomenally well. Like, you look at it for like 5 seconds and you're like, wow, like this is totally different than what I could do before. Do you feel like there are examples where you see really compelling demos, but then you don't see explosive growth companies coming out of those use cases?
I actually think that's true for for the vast majority of like sophisticated code gen today, right? Like you can, like if you want something to work in a production environment and you have like a normal size repo for a normal size application, it doesn't work enough today, right? Like, and we can argue whether the problem is research or engineering, but I think there's a lot of work to get it to do what you can occasionally demonstrate with like one example, one very sexy demo. And so I'd say like, are there very broadly adopted tools in CodeGen today besides Copilot? No, I think like there's some heat around Cursor. I think people like the experience, but there's not much else. And I think that will not be true a year from now. I also think that like all of the, this is a massive generalization, but the experimentation with agents is extremely unreliable today, right? Like 1 out of 100 times, somebody who understands how these models work can get a task to completion that is sophisticated, and then that's the demo that people are showing. That doesn't mean it's not going to work. It just means like that's not like a normal human being user with a normal amount of user patience, which is to say none, is not going to use that broadly today.
This happened in the 90s too. They had all these really cool like mobile phone and, device related demos. And they basically imagined all the stuff that was going to happen, and none of it worked in the 90s, right? And so they literally had to invent like a new way of writing letters. It was called like graffiti, right? For like these Palm Pilot, like pseudo like smartphones, so that a phone could actually interpret what you were writing for handwriting recognition, right? You had to learn to write letters a different way and stuff like that. And so I feel like we're kind of in that era for a lot of these AI applications, including what Sarah mentioned regarding agents. It's clear what's going to happen 10 years from now. It's just going to take 10 years in some cases.
Or maybe 10 months. I don't know. It's hard to say with the time limit.
Yeah. Or 3 months
long.
once we have the singularity through,
yeah.
self-coding agents. Yeah, exactly. Through Q-Star. I'm actually very worried about Q-Star. So I was thinking of resigning this podcast as part of Q-Star.
If Q-Star is listening, we are friendly. We're on your side.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, okay. So nothing says guy I don't want to meet like a LinkedIn profile that claims to be a blockchain and AI expert. But I think a lot of you, that's something you might actually like put on your LinkedIn and like truly.
Only with a hashtag. Only with a hashtag.
Good hashtag both of them, yeah.
Hashtag blockchain, hashtag AI, hashtag generative, hashtag looking for work.
So one question I have is what lives at the intersection?
Such a troll.
Okay, so one question is like how could these work together? But before we get to that,
Q-Star.
I'm curious if you Q-Star. Damn it. Sorry.
What? It's just garbage collection.
Do you think there's any lessons from blockchain for like AI in terms of hype cycle?
Blockchain now has had like 3 hype cycles, right? And in each one, you had a flood of people in, and then you had sort of a new level reached in terms of utilization, new products, et cetera. And then you had sort of these collapses. And one could argue a similar thing has happened over the history of machine learning and AI, where you had these subsequent waves of hype around different technologies. Obviously, there was really early sort of neural network-based things that ended up substantiating many years later, but that were kind of hyped and then kind of died for a while. And so I think in general, technology kind of follows these same waves. And, I'm still a long-term believer in different applications of blockchain, but I think they have to be driven by the underlying technology and capabilities that are provided by the technology. And so you need something where the trustless nature of the system matters, where encryption matters, where a variety of things matter. Otherwise, you have a really shitty database, right? It's basically what a lot of blockchains are. And similarly with AI, there's going to be a lot of hype around certain areas that we discussed already, like agents or other areas. And those things may be long-term correct. It's just what happens in the short run and how much hype occurs around them. And then does that kind of hurt the capability to work on them for a while? I think payments is a really interesting analog where arguably a lot of the FUD around payments was spread by ex-PayPal people, because PayPal had a really tough time dealing with fraud and other things in the early 2000s because there wasn't a lot of signal on the internet. So it's hard to tell what were fraudulent fraudulent transactions. And so then for about a decade, nobody really worked on payments because they kept hearing how hard and awful it was, right? And so often these hype cycles lead to sort of almost delays in technology. And then you had Square and Stripe and Adyen and all these great companies get built around payments later, right? And so I think there was all sorts of missed opportunities for a couple of years because of that. And so my hope is that with the AI wave, we're going to have proper rapid adoption relative to things not working, but then people exploring them as soon as they can after, right? Because there's going to be some really important tech that's going to get built that isn't going to work the first or second time around.
So I'm also a long-term believer. Like you look at the problem set and it's still really interesting, right? Cheap rails, privacy, smart contracts, the ability to programmatically manage value, real-time payments, like decentralized money systems. I think there's a lot of demand for solutions. Like the question is the solution competitive? And then what's the noise, right? This last cycle, actually all the cycles, but this last cycle in crypto was extremely noisy in that I think there's a bunch of confusion between speculation and people believing that making money at any point in the cycle, often based on some like lesser fools theory, was like a signal of permanence or brilliance, right? Like one of my favorite books is this book, A Brief History of Financial Euphoria. It's like way less boring than the title actually makes it sound. It's like 75 pages. It's great. But there's like, you don't have to read the book. There's like 2 lessons in the book, one of which is like, whenever people make a ton of money in a hype cycle, they think they're really smart, right? And I think the ability to quickly make money in a speculative cycle in crypto made people, of course, like overhype like the potential of the technology and its competitiveness at that point. I think if you like contrast that with AI, like, yeah, there's a little bit of people making money quickly, right? Like, I'm really good at like SEO for a ChatGPT wrapper. And like, I might make a little bit of money for a brief period of time, but it's not pure speculation. And so I think you don't have that level of noise around like this shift in technology.
Speaking of speculation, I feel like one speculative place where blockchain and AI may overlap is identity. And so I do think that if you move to like a agent-driven world, again, some N years in the future, and everything is represented in some form or another by an agent, which are interacting with each other programmatically. So you have an agent that represents a government service, an agent that represents an enterprise or a part of it, an agent that represents you. Then there may be certain circumstances where you want to act anonymously or pseudonymously with a service and have your agent act on your behalf. And there it's going to have to present cryptographic credentials that represent you. It's going to, in some cases, partially shield or provably shield certain types of data, so ZK or other things may kick in. And so you end up potentially with this really interesting world where identity and certain aspects of your data then reside on the blockchain. It may not happen that way. The other place where people talk about the overlap between these things is using crypto as like payment rails for AI, because then you have this, again, algorithmic ability to interact with it. I think you could also just do that with a bank account, right? Like it doesn't have to be that complicated, but there may be these interesting overlaps over time, particularly if you want to have a secured form of third-party identity that your agents can use or interact with.
Interesting. Well, I guess speaking of hype cycles, it does seem like a lot of people notice that even in this kind of moment where, most entrepreneurs are having trouble raising money, you see AI companies raising, sometimes especially foundation model companies, at these really astronomical valuations. And you see, investors kind of simultaneously complaining about the valuations while, participating often in these funding rounds. I'm curious how you think about it. Like when you look at some of these kind of multi-billion-dollar valuation foundation model rounds, have you done any of them? Do you sort of like laugh at that and sneer at that, or where do you land on these things? I realize it's a general question, so if you want to get any specifics of any deals, that would be extra fun.
I think all these insane valuations are driven by Sarah.
Yeah, with my early stage fund. One woman moving the market. Hey, multi-billion-dollar valuations. Come
Thanks,
at
Sarah.
me.
As an entrepreneur, I appreciate you.
If it's under $1 billion, it's like not worth her time. She's like,
yeah. What are you, small time?
Yeah.
It's interesting how affected investors are by a single example, right? Like if there were 2 reasons that valuations are what they are in certain types of AI companies today, the 2 reasons are named OpenAI and NVIDIA. That's it, right? I think like once you have examples of exponential growth, then the business model, like the value of being a market leader in a particular component of what looks like a new stack is really obvious. And so the obvious ideas, there's a stampede toward. And so I think one piece is that, and then one piece is a more, I think like true or fundamental piece, which is like if it is a general purpose technology and it allows you to create many new experiences, and you believe in a monopolistic or oligopolistic like market structure eventually, then the leaders are worth quite a lot of money. And so I can see I think we can both make fun of like the herd mentality and say like there's potential value at the beginning of a technology shift in like the core parts of the stack.
Yeah, I think there's kind of three related points to what Sarah's saying. Number one is, most things in any sort of company or value creation related event, everything follows a power law, right? And so fundamentally, a small number of companies are going to be worth the most. It's kind of crazy, actually, if you look at it, like the top 3 or 4 tech companies add up to the entire biopharma industry's market cap across everything. Public companies, pharmaceutical companies, you name it, right? And so you see this enormous aggregation of value and valuation. And
every time I call a lot about some biotech company, he's like, Sarah, spent years of my life on this, just do software.
I don't say that. I say, save the world, Sarah. Why are you only doing software? You should really help other people.
How did you come to that point of view?
Which point of view?
Save
The
the
Sarah
world?
one or the power law one?
The anti-biotech bias.
I don't have an anti-biotech bias. I just think it's in some cases more challenging, and so you just need to know what you're getting into, and you also have to realize there's big differences in market structure relative to software. So I do think there's big opportunities in biotech. I think that, back to the power law point, fundamentally you see this massive aggregation of value relative to a small handful of companies, and it drops off rapidly is sort of the other point. And so everybody looks at the head of the power law and they don't look at the tail. And if you look at the head only, then everything is dramatically undervalued, because if you have multiple trillion-dollar companies, hey, if this thing could be a trillion-dollar company, then of course it's worth entering at any price or investing at any price. But the flip side of it is most companies aren't those trillion-dollar companies. And so there's actually a very strong elbow in the distribution if you look at traditional venture capital investing, where above $2 billion valuations get really hard to make a lot of money off of for almost every company, because most things don't end up being a multiple on $2 billion. And one of the big mistakes that people made during the COVID era is public market valuations ran up 3 to 4x. And so private market valuations did the same, which means all the companies that should have been worth $500 million or a few $100 million ended up getting valued at $1 billion to $2 billion. And anything that should have been worth $1 billion was valued at $3 to $4 billion. And so you have this really big overhang of companies now that are overvalued. The way that applies to AI is, again, people are interpreting everything as being the next OpenAI. But most things are going to fail. And if you're an investor who just happens to hit the next Midjourney and the next OpenAI and the next character and the next whatever thing that ends up getting really big, then you'll look like a genius if you overpay and then suddenly it grows into that valuation. But most people are not going to hit those things. Most investments are going to be bad, back to that point of 99% will fail or whatever number. And so you end up with this weird tension, right? In any given era, the most valuable companies always look dramatically overpriced at the time of the investment and really cheap in hindsight. That was Facebook at 500 million. Oh my God, you're paying $500 million for Facebook. And then Facebook at $1 billion. Oh my God, you're paying $1 billion for Facebook. That was literally the conversation people were having. And now it's a multi-$100 billion company, right? At the flip side of it is there was like 24 other social networks at the time of Facebook that had gone to zero, basically. So if you chose Facebook, you're a genius. If you chose any of the other 20-something companies, then you didn't do as well. And that's going to happen in AI as well. And I think people are mixing the very best with the very worst and just giving a bucket high valuation to everything.
I do think one dynamic here is just like the dynamics that Elad describes are like generally true. And then if you believe that this is a really massive shift that changes market structure, it's not that all the companies are going to happen in year one, but there's a period of time for leadership, like emergence of market leaders, that where like a window will close, right? And if you look, you can pick any industry, and technology is like software for, be it consumers or enterprise businesses, is one of the most dynamic. But if you look at other industries, bio, defense, right? Like many of the market leaders in these industries have been the market leaders for decades. And so it depends on how much you think it is like emergence of new market or like actually fundamental shift. Because if it is, then I think a part of the dynamic around pricing is, there's some period of time where emergence of new market leaders will happen, and like not after that, or it becomes very hard to compete with competitors that have already built a customer base and moats.
I agree with that. I think one thing to add to that, though, is that that could also argue for waiting. And there are some firms or investors that are just waiting on this stuff, right? Like both Sarah and I, have in each of our cases have tended to invest early and stuff. But the flip side of it is, you can make the argument that if you look at the last 10 years of Google, or the last 10 years of Apple, or the last 10 years of Amazon, or the last 10 years of name your company, they've grown dramatically more in the last 10 years than they have in the prior 10 years in terms of just market cap growth, right? And so Microsoft, I think, added they're worth, say, $2.5 trillion. They added 2.25 trillion of that over the last 10 years, right? Or NVIDIA, 12 years ago or whenever it was worth $6 billion in the public markets. So you could also make the counter argument of, if these things end up being very fundamental, why not just wait and see which ones work, and then invest
just
either as a late stage private investor, invest in the public markets, whatever it is. But if you're thinking of it purely as an investment perspective, you could always just wait for stuff if you are able to, right?
Lucas, this is foundation shaking. I come to do a podcast with two friends, and instead I'm like,
we rocked his world.
Oh my, no, I mean, you rocked my world. Now I'm like, what am I doing with my early stage fund? Just be a hedge fund investor. It's a lot simpler.
Yeah, hedge funds. That's the takeaway. Just do private equity. Just wait 40 years until you can do buyouts.
What's the fun in
that? That'd be my
advice.
Yeah.
Breaking news on Gradient Dissent.
Yeah. While we're on UBI, just start doing private equity with your UBI money.
Do you think that the fact that these companies require so much upfront capital to build these models affects the investment market at all?
Yeah, absolutely.
Most of the AI world doesn't. Yeah. Well.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'd say the set of companies, I'm not saying it's like rational, but there's some set of companies that want to train their models themselves. And, I would argue the vast majority, more than 99% of companies that are going to create a ton of value, like, should not be training general foundation models from scratch. Like, there is plenty of work to do in terms of productization and making something work for a particular workflow or industry. That being said, like, you need a certain scale to compete in terms of quality, and that scale is not tens or hundreds of GPUs today, which means it's really, really expensive. And then if an entrepreneur if the market is willing to bear it, and an entrepreneur can raise the capital, then they're not going to give away more than X% of their company, and there's an implied valuation. And then there are comparisons if you think that you're in a head company, not a tail company, right? And so I think that's what's happened in the foundation model, like tiny segment of the market. But I think like the idea of no GPU before product market fit, or like some of the companies that even Elad and I have been involved in that have trained really competitive models without spending that much upfront are really exciting, right? The core premise of venture capital traditionally was capital efficient growth. And so like, I think that like the desire to spend a lot on compute upfront to get to a certain scale and quality has infected parts of the market where it's not actually relevant.
Yeah, I'd view it through two different segmentations. I think one is which part of the stack are you playing at? And if you look at traditional waves of technology, you often end up with, say, I don't know what, I'm making up the numbers, 30-40% of the value goes to infra, 20% goes to tooling, and then 30-40% goes to applications on top of that. And I don't see any reason that this pattern will be different here. There'll be lots and lots of apps things that end up being really valuable where you don't actually have to train a model. And then obviously there'll be all sorts of models that will be really valuable. I think separate from that, there's just this view of, and again, the apps are probably going to be dramatically more capital efficient in most cases. I think there's a second approach, which is just saying, what are you actually doing? And how important is a model to it? And then looking at it from the perspective of, is it a diffusion model or a LLM or foundation model, because diffusion models are dramatically cheaper to train. If you're doing something in image or video, the fidelity can be a little bit lower, right? You flip 2 pixels, it's fine. You flip 2 words, it can change the whole meaning of a paragraph. And so I would assume that many more diffusion model companies or diffusion model based companies will do their own training. They, in some cases, shouldn't, but they can at least afford to much more readily. And in some cases, you just want to use stable diffusion and fine tune it or do whatever with it and just see if anybody cares, right? And then on the LLM side, there may be more examples where you should be training a model, but there's probably lots and lots of examples, again, where people are just doing it inappropriately. And there's almost a break on people doing it inappropriately, because a year ago, people were willing to fund all sorts of new models for random specific applications. And now everybody's just saying, why don't you just do it on GPT-4 first and see if the damn thing works or if anybody cares, right? And so I do think over the last year, the willingness to fund at least the LLM side of it has gone down, with a small number of counterexamples where you have an exceptional person starting the company or people starting the company, and or there's a very clearly defined reason that you should be training a model.
I also think the introduction of like Llama 2 and Mistral, even at the 7B size, have dramatically changed the market, right? Because you have a set of applications where, continue pre-training or fine-tuning on a particular data set becomes viable without a huge amount of spend.
I like how you say Mistral the French way. That was really cool. I'm going to start doing that. Le Mistral. Wait,
what's the American way?
Mistral.
Oh, no. Ew. Sacre bleu.
Yeah, Le Mistral is the, how you say croissant, no?
Arthur, I'm sorry if you're listening.
Yeah, I blame Sarah for this as well.
Do you guys notice the trend that I do where
more
I
French
get pitched
founders,
all the
yes.
French founders, good founders.
Actually, a real aside, I've been very impressed by the French ecosystem relative to AI, right? You have Mistral, you have Dust, you have Llama 2, in part being led by folks in France. There's a number of really cool French companies happening right now, and I think it's been super impressive. So
Hugging Face, really Streamlit. Totally.
Hugging Face. Yeah, there's a lot of great French founders. And I think that's actually been a shift over the last couple of years. And I think it's really accelerated with AI. And I think that's been awesome.
Do you think that, or do you see this trend where we've had founders, even on this podcast, where they say, oh, we train on, we use lots of different models, but they just use GPT 3.5. And it's like, why don't you just come out and say that? Like, do you get that same experience, and do you think it matters? Like, do you want to see this like diversity of underlying possible LLMs?
If you think about why people are posturing that way, I think they're trying to demonstrate defensible value. Like, we have some unique IP, and I mean, first of all, like, if it's not legitimately driving new capability and it's not important to delivering customer value, then like, no, I think investors should not want to see that, right? Using a diversity of models or pretending that the core driver of the product isn't like OpenAI seems like a mistake. If only because being intellectually honest within the organization allows you to make better decisions. So like, I don't think I see actually a lot of that posturing. A lot, do you?
I don't see a lot of posturing. I think the pattern that I've observed, particularly in larger enterprises that have any sort of scale, is they'll prototype on GPT-4 just to see if the thing could work. And then if it can work, they start making cost and performance trade-offs, because obviously, if you're using like GPT-4, like inferencing may be smaller, maybe slower than on a smaller model, it may cost more, et cetera. And so what I see people do is they start trying to fine tune either 3.5 or Llama or something else, Mistral or other things. And then what they do is they start building like an orchestrator that will like route a specific type of use case or traffic or prompt or whatever to the cheaper model in certain use cases, and then to GPT-4 for everything else if they need really high performance or chain of logic or other things. So I've kind of observed this evolution, and there's very few people at the scale to actually justify that, right? And so usually it's pre-existing companies that have real user volume who are doing these things, or it's companies with very specific use cases where, they have sufficient usage and they really need that fine tuning, or they really need, that extra performance. But most people can just use GPT and they'll be fine.
Yeah, I think it's probably helpful to reason about a specific company. And it's like, we're all podcasters here. If you look at a product like Descript, they use a huge family of models, right? Because each of them powers different features, and sometimes you need a combination of models to power a feature. And it's a lot of what Elad said, right? You have latency, availability, cost. You might have reasoning to a specific domain. You might just want control. To use another really specific example, like if you're just doing summarization, GPT-4 is a really expensive, slow way to do simple summarization, right? And so I definitely think there are reasons people need to use a huge set of models, like some of which they control. And then I think maybe where I differ from a little bit here is I think the majority of those use cases are going to be medium to large companies. But I do think there's also companies that are experimenting with chaining a bunch of different calls together, or doing fan out of different generations and then evaluation. And if you are doing that at scale, the sort of cost and latency becomes an issue, right? I'm very willing to bet that the APIs from the largest foundation model labs get faster and cheaper, but I think the dynamic of people will want to do more with them will continue, and so you actually have demand for both a diverse set.
Do you really observe that at scale, Mistral is more cost effective than GPT? I really like these open source models, and I root for them, but it sort of feels to me if you really computed your total cost of ownership, it probably ends up costing more. I mean, I could see privacy reasons for using them, or maybe some kind of control, but I'm kind of surprised that people would switch off of GPT 3.5 for cost reasons alone.
I think at a huge volume of calls, yes, it does matter, but we also don't have the comparison yet, just to be clear, right? Today, it's apples and oranges. You have a 7 billion parameter model and a trillion parameter model, and so we don't know. I think the thing that the Mistral folks have demonstrated...
the smaller model should be cheaper, right, from an inference perspective.
Uh-huh.
Unless you get some giant break on the GPT side, right?
Yes. I think the thing that was interesting that Mistral demonstrated that sort of surprised the research and technical community is what you can get out of a 7 billion parameter model, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The idea that you can get significant reasoning at all versus at 34B or larger.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it certainly should be cheaper, but if you're a real company that has to run it, you need to make high availability servers that are running it, and you might not have the volume to get
but I assume a lot of these things will push into third-party companies, right? Perplexity has actually launched Mistral and Llama as sort of very clean, simple APIs. I don't know if you saw like Brain Trust announcement around their sort of AI proxy and the ability to basically use the OpenAI SDK to query multiple different types of models. And so I think a lot of this stuff is just going to get solved via infrastructure, where different people are going to be building out the ability to interrogate or interact with these models, either as standalone APIs, which are really simple to access, or as third-party infrastructure that you can build on top of. And so I do think all these things are going to be increasingly solve problems over time, and you won't have to necessarily have all the AI ops and DevOps and everything else to deal with it over time.
Yeah, I don't think the state, like even 6 months from now, is most companies, even that want to use open source models, like standing up an ML ops team to manage, for example, availability and inference on their own. I think there's a very small number of companies that have the expertise and scale where that, like, or the specificity of needs where that makes sense. And the rest will use APIs, like from Perplexity or from the vendors or others, or inference platforms like Base 10.
Although open source frameworks might also make it easier to do this, like Llama, CPP, and others.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Do you have a point of view on the question everybody asks around sort of open source models versus closed source models? Like, do you, and you can't say both. I know you're going to say both in cases like one versus the other, but do you like long term, like rolling out into the future, like where do you think this lands?
Why can't we say both?
I guess you can say both. I don't know. I'm going for the clicks here.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting because I just don't think that there are, I think it's very fun to think of like the neat strategic answer for how a market plays out. But you look at you look at a bunch of large markets historically and you're like, you know who's making a ton of money in observability? Grafana, right? And you know who else is making a ton of fucking money in observability? Datadog. It's not clear to me that like we're trending toward one direction or another. I think if a vendor behaves very poorly and they own a core component of infrastructure and there's enough investment from central open source players. So think of like Oracle databases and then the, long-term engineering migration to things like Postgres, right? It's because like there were vendors who kept their customers captive and enough of an incentive for the rest of the ecosystem with really strong engineering teams to like invest in an open source alternative. And so it feels harder than it used to say like there's going to be a database, a closed source like relational database company that emerges. But I think if you look at most markets, they're just not deterministic in terms of structure between open and closed. I think from an orientation perspective, like I'm super amazed by all of the research progress that you can have if you have the direction and like speed of a team like OpenAI, and also like the broader open source engineering world and the ecosystem investment in things like Llama and Mistral, I think are going to be great. Elad, you have to choose because I gave the wishy-washy answer.
Yeah, and I have to apologize. I need to drop off after this question. And so I don't know if you want me to answer this or answer something else or just drop off. So apologies for that.
No. Actually, here's a quick question I would love to get out of both of you is what is an underrated aspect of machine learning that you think people should pay more attention to or that you would like to explore more?
I think there's a lot of really interesting, like real world use cases of ML that are now tractable that I think would be really cool to see people do stuff with. But some of them also have interesting subtle implications. I'll give you an example. Like one project that I think is kind of interesting is, if you look at scientific fraud, particularly in biology, there's like 3 or 4 ways that people consistently commit fraud. And you should be able to build an ML model that can start flagging lots and lots of cases where people just made up stuff, or they reused a gel, or the table doesn't quite make sense relative to the data in it, And so I actually think there's all sorts of things like that that could be super interesting. That's maybe different from your question, and it's more focused on the application side. On the non-application side, I think there's memory and there's a couple other things that will be really important as you start chaining some of these models that I think could be engineered in dramatically more elegant ways that people could potentially address. And then obviously there's other forms of understanding that could be really interesting in terms of mathematics or scientific models or other things like that, material science-based models. Like I think there's lots and lots and lots to do, both in terms of specific models to train specific capabilities to build like memory or math, or specific application areas like fraud, scientific fraud. And I have to apologize. I need to drop off. So,
no, thank you so much.
I'm supposed to go.
I think it's a good note to end on.
Drop off and ask Sarah the last question too. I'll let you know what she says.
All right.
The question is just like what applications you're excited about.
No, it's like, what do you think is an underrated or underexplored part of machine learning that you might encourage, someone starting out in the field to look at, or if you had extra time, you would want to look into it?
Extra time. So I think that one thing that's just going to be a little bit slower is anything that requires operational understanding of workflows where the context is hard to gather or the data is not necessarily well collected today. But the problem really fits machine learning, right? And so like we talked about code generation and like some of that data exists today and some doesn't, right? Like how does something fit into a, does code work in a production environment is not data that is easily collected, but I think could be really compelling. I think you can extend it to lots of tasks that feel tenable, that are high operational toil. It's basically everything I think like people should spend less time on because it is a high cost knowledge work job that is, some huge percentage of it is like very repetitive, right? And so imagine be on call and data collection for incident resolution, right? What am I doing? I'm looking at a bunch of Grafana dashboards. I am writing queries into Datadog or Splunk. I have some understanding of how these systems work. And like many of the steps I would take in managing an incident or even deciding if something is like actually a problem are repetitive. And engineers don't generally enjoy the like be paged at 2 a.m. and figure out if it's a problem. So if you can reduce that just a little bit, that feels interesting. I think a similar dynamic exists in like security operations. If we move away from technical fields into like HR operations, like answer questions for people based on workday policy in different countries or in like corporate FP&A. Like you have people who do all of these tasks at your company, Lukas, but explain like budget variance, budget versus actual variance for every line in your income statement. That's actually like something that requires context, but I think is highly automatable so teams can go do more strategic planning, right? So I think the theme here would be if you look at all of these high expense, high expertise, knowledge work tasks that are actually really repetitive, like I think it's mostly like a context problem, right? And I think that's a really interesting shape.
Thanks so much for the chat. We'll stop it there, but I think that was great.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
Okay. Well, this is fun.
Awesome.
I hope you got some stuff that you guys can cut into an interesting podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Grading Dissent. Please stay tuned for future episodes.